welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I'm thrilled to see repeat guests to our Ink on Shrink series. I was just hearing from this couple here about how much they loved our series and wish more people knew about it, so please do spread the word. We actually said our writers are so much better than anywhere else, and that they were thrilled with the events we're having here. So congratulations, everyone, for being a part of it, tonight's reader. The next and last installment of the Ink on Shrink series will be on December 5th. It'll be Roger Rosenblatt and Misha Smith, who's right here. At 5 p.m. that same night, we are hosting an open house for those interested in pursuing an MFA in creative writing. We're also, for the first time, having an MFA in theater with tracks in dramaturgy, directing, playwriting, and film. And this summer, we're having visual arts as well at our summer conference. This January, there are conferences in the Turkana Basin, Kenya. Yay! Hosted by Julie Sheehan, who did the poetry. We're hoping it won't be too big of a war zone while we're there.
Exactly.
And also in Florence, and we're very excited about both of those. For the first time this year, we have a short film prize for undergraduate students, so if you know any budding, aspiring young filmmakers, please tell them about it. We also have a short play prize for the first time, and here's the flyer for the MFA in theater. And we've had playwriting classes here for the last couple of years, and one of our students, Dorothy Marchik, has a play running. A musical journey of African American women from Bessie Smith to Beyonce, and she has some free tickets if you cuddle up with her after. She'll share them with you. I would also like to thank our student Patrick Dunn for shooting this event. He's there behind the video camera. And to introduce this evening's event, I would like to introduce you to our very first Manhattan Track graduate student, Suzanna Filip. She's written a memoir that is about the recovery from being tied up with zip ties by a gang of professional hitmen. And the recovery from that led her to invent something quite creative in her own psyche. So it's a kind of ink on shrinks in and of herself. It's called The Other Me, and she'll be introducing tonight's reader. So please welcome Suzanna.
Hi, everybody. Copies of Andrew Solomon's book, The Noonday Demon, An Atlas of Depression, which won the 2001 National Book Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, aren't always kept in the same place at the Barnes & Noble in Tribeca. Sometimes they're lined up in the stacks. Sometimes they're in a pile on the tables out front. And sometimes, when the supply is dwindling, there's a copy tucked behind the cardboard tree in the children's section. That's my copy, or it used to be my copy. That copy is now at home on my bookshelf, but that's where I kept it before I bought it, just to be certain that it'd be there when I got back. I couldn't go to the library anymore. There were too many people I didn't know on the 3rd floor of the New York Public Library in the massive reading room, and the silence made my ears ring. But I needed the book. I was trying to be choosy, adding only to the knee-high pile of books on trauma and depression the worthwhile ones, the ones that actually made a difference, helped me understand, feel not so alone. I needed the books that gave me the language to talk about what was happening to me when I struggled to put words into an order that made sense and conveyed my chaos, my agitation, and my desperation to find my own way through. Until I purchased my book, I'd wander home along the Hudson River, compulsively reading sections of the Noonday Demon's last chapter, Hope, that I'd copied into a little yellow notebook that fit into my pocket. Among other poignant affirmations, Andrew writes, "No matter how bad you feel, you have to do everything you can to keep living, even if all you can do for the moment is breathe. Wait it out, and occupy the time of waiting as fully as you possibly can. Hold on to time, don't wish your life away. Even the minutes when you feel you are going to explode are minutes of your life, and you will never get those minutes back. It is with a heartfelt thank you and great admiration that I introduce tonight Andrew Solomon.
Well, I think that may have been the nicest introduction that I've ever had, and far nicer than I wanted to deserve. But when you said that sometimes the books are on the tables out at the front of the store, I thought you meant the remainder thing. Thank you for all of that. So I'm going first tonight because I decided that for an evening about therapy, one really should describe being miserable, and one shouldn't be describing things that were entertaining and light. So I'm just sort of heavy stuff at the start. And I'm going to read you an excerpt from the introduction of the book that I have been writing since the aforementioned one came out 10 years ago, which I am supposed to turn in by Thanksgiving after working on it. I'm nearly there. But anyway, it remains something of a work in progress. It hasn't been edited. I've never read from any of this stuff before, but I thought I would dig it out. Here we are. I had dyslexia as a child. Indeed, I have it now. I cannot write by hand without spending enormous energy focusing on each letter as I form it. And even when I do so, some letters are omitted or out of order. I often mistake letters or numbers when I am reading quickly. My mother identified the dyslexia early, and she worked on reading with me hour after hour after hour, starting when I was 2. I spent long afternoons, summer and winter, in her lap, learning how to sound out words, training like an Olympic athlete in phonetics. We made flashcards together and played games with them in the car. She got or made me a notebook with a yellow felt cover on which Winnie the Pooh and Tigger were sewn, and we practiced letters as though no shapes could be lovelier than theirs. I reveled in the attention, and my mother taught with humor and fun, as though it were the best puzzle in the world, a private game between us. When I was 6, I applied to 11 schools in New York City, and all 11 turned me down on grounds that I would never learn to read or write. I spent first grade at a school that would take anyone who lived in the neighborhood. For second grade, I was enrolled in a school where they grudgingly allowed the fact that I already read ahead of grade level to overrule test scores that purported to reveal my inability to learn to read at all. The standards of perpetual triumph were high in our house, and that early victory over dyslexia was very formative for us. With care, patience, love, intelligence, and will, we had trounced an obvious neurological abnormality. Unfortunately, it set the stage for our later struggles by making it hard to believe that we couldn't reverse the creeping evidence of another perceived neurological abnormality, that of my being gay. I was popular at home, but I was subject to corrections. And I didn't yet understand the when or the why of them. I was at Indian Walk Shoes with my mother and my brother when I was 7, and the salesman asked what color balloons we'd like when we left. My brother wanted a red balloon. I wanted a pink balloon. My mother countered that I didn't want a pink balloon, and reminded me that my favorite color was blue. I said I really wanted the pink, but under her glare, I took the blue one. The fact that my favorite color is now blue, but I am still gay, is evidence of both my mother's influence and its limits. She once said to me, when you were little, you didn't like to do what other kids like to do, and I encouraged you to be yourself. She added, only half ironically, I sometimes think I let things go too far. I have sometimes thought that she didn't let them go far enough, but her encouragement of my individuality, although less ambivalent from day one, has shaped my life. During my first year at my new school, Bobby Finkel had a birthday party and invited everyone in the class but me. My mother called Mrs. Finkel on the assumption that there had been a mistake. Mrs. Finkel said that Bobby didn't like me and didn't want me at his party. My mother picked me up at school on the day and took me to the zoo and for a hot fudge sundae at old-fashioned Mr. Jennings. I remember feeling particularly loved that afternoon, and it's only in retrospect that I imagine how hurt my mother was on my behalf. More hurt than I was, or let myself notice I was. I didn't guess then, as I do now, that her tenderness was a bid to compensate for the insults of the world. When I contemplate parental homophobia in our household, I can see how vulnerable my vulnerabilities made my mother, and how much she wanted to preempt my sadness with the assurance that we were our own celebration. I suppose that forbidding the pink balloon must be held in this context as in part a protective gesture. As I grew older, I learned that our family rule was to be interested in otherness from within a pact of sameness. I wanted to stop observing the wide world and inhabit its wideness, even when I didn't understand fully what that wideness looked like. I think that part of my desire to transform myself sprang from my understanding that I was already not like the others. From one angle, this desire can be seen as an attempt to slip the traces that bound me to an undesirable way of being. From another, it feels like a gesture toward my essential self, the beginning of who in fact I was to become. Part of me was made by having the protections of ordinariness shorn away, but part of me was made by building up this defensive singularity, and each thing was so deeply a product of the other that separating them out is a fool's errand. Long after childhood, I clung to childish things as a dam against sexuality. This willful immaturity was overlaid with an affected Victorian prudery, aimed not at masking but at obliterating desire. I had some deranged idea that I would be Christopher Robin forever in the 100-acre wood. Indeed, the final chapter of the Winnie the Pooh books felt so much like my story that I couldn't bear to hear it, though I had my father read me all the other chapters hundreds of times. The house at Pooh Corner ends wherever they go, and whatever happens to them on the way, in that enchanted place on top of the forest, a little boy and his bear will always be playing. I decided that I would be that boy and that bear, that I would freeze myself in puerility, because what adulthood portended for me was too different from what it portended for everyone else. Everyone hates himself from time to time, but I wanted to extirpate so much of myself. I bought a copy of Playboy and spent hours studying it, trying to resolve my discomfort with female anatomy. It was much more grueling than my math homework. I knew I had to grow up and sleep with women, and I felt that I couldn't do so, and I thought often about dying. The half of me that wasn't planning to be Christopher Robin playing forever with my beloved bear in an enchanted place was planning to be Anna Karenina throwing myself in front of a train. It was a ludicrous duality. When I was 18, I read an ad in the back of New York Magazine that offered surrogate therapy for people who had issues with sexual relationships. I still believed the problem of whom I wanted was subsidiary to the problem of whom I didn't want. I knew the back of the magazine was not a good place to find treatment, but I believed my condition was too embarrassing to reveal to anyone who knew my name. Taking my saved-up allowance to a dark, book-lined office on West 45th Street, I subjected myself to long conversations about my sexual anxieties, unable to admit to myself or the therapist that what I had was actually just a lack of interest in women. I didn't mention the busy sexual life I had by this time with men. I was accepted for counseling from people I was encouraged to call doctors who would prescribe exercises with my surrogates. Women who were not exactly prostitutes, but who were also not exactly anything else. I remember one protocol in which I had to crawl around naked on all fours pretending to be a dog, while the surrogate crawled around pretending to be a cat. The metaphor of enacting intimacy between two types with a natural mutual aversion is more loaded with meaning than I noticed at the time. I became curiously fond of these women, one of whom, an attractive blonde from the Deep South, eventually told me that she was a necrophiliac who had taken this job after she got into trouble down at the morgue. You were supposed to keep switching girls, so your ease was not limited to one sexual object. I remember the first time a Puerto Rican woman climbed on top of me and began to bounce up and down, crying ecstatically, "You're in me! You're in me!" And how I lay there wondering with anxious boredom whether I had finally achieved the prize and become a qualified heterosexual. I tried to repress what I felt strongly, and to feel strongly what I didn't, hoping to leave everyone else's life intact by blighting my own. Cures are fine when they work swiftly and fully, but they seldom do for anything other than bacterial infection. My own recovery has been not from illness, but from the perception of illness. That office on 45th Street shows up in my dreams. The necrophiliac who found my pale, sweaty form close enough to a corpse to float her boat. The mission-driven Latino woman who introduced me into her body with so much triumph. The interviews before and after each encounter. It took only 2 hours a week for a period of about 6 months, and to its credit, it paved the way for later heterosexual experiences, which I'm glad to have had. I truly love some of the women with whom I eventually had relationships, and I loved the honesty with which I could talk to them by then about my sexual history. When I was with them, however, I could never forget that my cure was a distilled manifestation of self-loathing. And I have never entirely forgiven the circumstances that disposed me to make that obscene effort. The gusto I put into eviscerating what I mistook for damage would have met the energy needs of greater New York for a year. Thank you.
A sense of humor is the best indicator that you will recover. It is often the best indicator that people will love you. Sustain that, and you have hope. A nonfiction book proposal. Thank you, Diet Coke. Insert a witty tagline here about Patricia Marx. Table of contents. Chaplet 1. Quote, it was inevitable. Quote, James Siegelman, the president of the Harvard Lampoon, said at her acceptance. That is the entire chaplet. I won't be expanding or editing. Chaplet 2, on and off the avenue. Truly the only place to find an evaluation of current school supplies, where to buy eco-friendly yoga wear in Brooklyn, and of course, a tour of the Wall Street Duane Reade that has its own sushi chef, and where I'm convinced they're pumping in oxygen, just like they do at the casinos. Chaplet 3, a blank page, just because it's pretty. Chaplet 4, starting from happy, at least someone gets there, and is lucky enough to become intimately involved with a lingerie designer. Him, her, him again, the end of him, how to regain your virginity, and hopefully there's a blockbuster ending. Did I mention my fondness for all things underwear? Chaplet 5, well, you get the picture. There will be more, a lot more of them, as the term chaplet implies. There will be drawings, stick figures, a few hot potatoes here and there. Temperamentally terse, intimidatingly talented, astonishingly funny. Patricia Marx.
That too was the best introduction I had, and the best research. I have to talk to you afterward about how you got that Jim Siegelman quote, because I just sold a book about being on the Harvard Lampoon, and I have no memories and no research. You're writing it. I'm, as the program says, the surprise guest, and part of the surprise was mine when I discovered, after saying I would read about shrinks, that I've actually never written about shrinks. I did write a little bit, and I'm going to be reading that, but the second surprise I had was it wasn't really that funny. Nor was it moving. But I thought that I, instead of reading really the bit about shrink, I did go to a shrink, which is another surprise, because you'd think that I would have written about it, because I write about everything I do and call it fiction. I was in psychoanalysis for many years, and I called my shrink the cleaner, because I didn't want to tell anybody that I went to a shrink. And then I proceeded to tell everybody, oh, I go to a shrink, I call it the cleaner. So that was kind of productive. And the first day I went to the shrink, I said, I have to just tell you, I'm not going to cry, I'm not going to get angry at you, And transference, and yes, I wasn't really a very good patient. And then I said, and I'm not interested in being happy. I am not interested in being happy. I'm not here because I want to be happy. I don't care about being happy. I really don't want to be happy. And he interrupted me finally and said, don't worry. Successful. I am not going to read from the book with chaplets because there's really nothing about shrinks in that, but it does have a lot of chaplets and drawings by me. I'm going to read from the first book I ever wrote called Blockbuster, and it is the story of the making of the worst movie ever made, the film enactment of the Pilgrim's Progress. And there is a shrink in it, and I will be reading from it's a oral history. But the beginning of it is a description of the founder of the studio. And it's really good to read from the beginning of your book because you don't really need a setup. If I stand back here, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. How about here? Chapter 1, Fade In, X.Y. Schwerdloff and his studio. When Rita Schwerdloff gave birth to a son on November 28, 1895, she had little idea that he would someday be the head of the most prestigious movie studio in Hollywood, and no idea whatsoever that in 1956 he would win the Irving Thalberg Memorial Award at the Oscars. She only knew that when she put a pillow over his face, the crying stopped a little. And she could get some sleep. The baby under that pillow was movie mogul X.Y. Schwerdloff. Riva and Joseph Schwerdloff, immigrants from Romania, raised their son to be proud and never to take from others those things that he could get himself. They did not give him a name, believing that if he gave himself the name, he would appreciate it more. At the age of 4, the baby Schwerdloff chose the name A.B., the only letters he knew. Later, he changed his name to X.Y., thinking A.B. sounded too Jewish. In 1910, Schwerdloff left the family rug business to form a motion picture production company with Lou Plotz, a furrier from the Bronx, to capitalize on the nation's burgeoning interest in motion pictures. During the early years of the movie business, audiences were so fascinated by the mere idea of moving pictures that they paid little attention to a film's content. Most of these early films ran no longer than a few minutes and consisted of a single incident. The first Plotz-Schwerdloff production, the 3-minute Folding the Wash, which was one of the big money makers of 1910, is considered a masterpiece of its genre. Film historians cite it as the first time someone sat down and stood up in the same movie. Plotz and Schwerdloff followed its success with Opening the Curtains, Digging a Hole, and the 6-minute Stripping the Bed, which so offended a group of Catholics they formed the Catholic League of Decency. A rift developed between Plotz and Schwerdloff when Schwerdloff wanted to introduce characters and stories into their movies, and Plotz objected. Plotz eventually resigned over this, frustrated that the business he used to know was gone. Quote, "The day I heard someone say subplot," he said, "I knew I was a stranger to this business." After Plotz's resignation, Schwerdloff ran the company single-handedly, soon transforming it into a major studio. The first thing Schwerdloff did was select a logo. He selected himself. The logo showed Schwerdloff in his office at his desk answering the phone. This is the only known example of a studio using its owner as its symbol of excellence. An astute predictor of trends in the industry, Schwerdloff made only 2 major mistakes in those early years. Though it was he who had the idea of selling food in theater lobbies, his idea, baked winter squash, did not catch on. "I'll never understand that," Schwerdloff said. Every time we have it at the house, people ask for seconds." A more costly mistake was Schwerdloff's opposition to talking pictures. He felt the addition of sound would lose the industry the deaf audience, and possibly the hard of hearing as well. A lot of people can hear a talking picture, Schwerloff used to say, but everyone hears a silent picture. Eventually, Schwerloff did produce talking pictures, convinced by his parents that the deaf were using the title cards as a crutch and could learn to hear if they really needed to. In the same way that babies can learn to swim if you throw them in the water. The Mr. Schwerloff studio produced fewer movies than the other movie studios, but Schwerloff kept tight control over them. Soon the studio gained a reputation as the most prestigious in Hollywood. In 1 year, their films, Young Charlemagne, Surprise Witness, and Miss Valor is Here, garnered 25 Academy Award nominations. As the head of the most respected Hollywood studio, Schwerloff was approached by President Roosevelt at the outbreak of World War II to rally the nation against the Japanese. In 1943, the studio released Tokyo, Kansas, a movie about a Japanese librarian in a small Kansas town who inserts propaganda into library books and in so doing, brainwashes the town and gives Japan its first foothold in the United States. Unsolicited by President Roosevelt, Schwerloff also produced Kraut Heads, a movie he hoped would show, and it did, that Schwerloff, in spite of his name, hated the Germans as much as everybody else did. Like all studios, the Mr. Schwerloff studio had its B pictures as well. Most successful among these were the Mel the Trout series, about a trout who saves a boy and his family, and once a whole town by alerting them to the dangers of life in the mountains. And the Big Dwayne series, starring ex-Olympic shot putter Kevin Blanc, who saves people by throwing things. Musicals were popular in the 30s and 40s, but the Mr. Schwerloff studio made only two. Mr. Schwerloff hated musicals. Anything worth singing is worth saying, he used to say. It wasn't just singing Mr. Schwerloff hated. He once told his secretary, Magdalene Brandeis, "Stop that humming, I hate music." Though Mr. Schwerloff hated the two musicals, Sing-a-Ling and Shore Leave, they were immensely successful at the box office. These were not only good professional years for Mr. Schwerloff. In 1938, his only son was born, his pride and joy, X.Y. Schwerloff Jr., later nicknamed Bucky after his teeth. X.Y. had two daughters, Julia and Amelia, and he liked them all right, but he had always wanted a boy. The day Bucky was born, Schwerloff was so happy he gave everyone at the studio a 7-pound, 3-ounce pastry replica of the infant. The pastries were designed by Jean-Paul of Le Cirque and Dr. Penn, Bucky's pediatrician. Schwerloff would give this gift every year to his employees on Bucky's birthday. As Bucky grew bigger, so did the pastries. These years, from 1935 to 1945, were the heyday of the Mr. Schwerloff studio. In large part, this was due to the family atmosphere. The family atmosphere X.Y. Schwerloff fostered. Concerned that his stars not stray down the wayward path of drug and drink that so many others had followed, Schwerloff sought actively to mold their characters and instill in them a sense of responsibility and self-worth. No star was ever given a raise simply because he or she was popular at the box office. The raise had to be earned. To get her $2,500 a week raise, Lillian Gish had to sweep out the garage door for a month. Schwerloff ran the studio with an iron hand, and his temper was legendary, but he guided the studio through 48 profitable years. Only 1960 showed a loss. Schwerloff was still at work when he died in 1961. He died of a heart attack when his film about a livestock farmer dealing with a flood, Bay of Pigs, opened the same day the United States learned it had suffered an unparalleled military humiliation in Cuban waters. Mistaking news reports of the disaster for reviews of his film, Schwerloff was appalled when he saw the headline that morning in that morning's Los Angeles Times, "Bay of Pigs disgraces U.S." When he read that President Kennedy would address the nation on the subject that night, Schwerloff's heart stopped forever. And I'm not going to read the Shrink, though I do have lots of it. I'm going to read the first at the Mr. Schwerloff studio. First studio to pan to a fireplace while characters made love. The rapscallion from Bavaria in 1923 silent. First studio to drop major characters from a classic and mangle the ending. There's No Place Like Home, adapted from Charles Dickens' Bleak House, 1920. First studio to do a movie with British accents. Simon the Orphan Boy, 1929. First studio to have a movie in which a woman disguises herself as a man and then has to smoke a cigar and nearly chokes to death. Let's Play Golf, 1933. First and only studio to use a chain letter to promote a movie. The Story of the Pony Express, 1953. First studio to release a movie that was not in Swedish and had a clock ticking so loudly you could not hear the characters talking. Paranoia, 1958.
So for this, you'll know that something is in parentheses when I go like this. On Rakoff. David, that is, although maybe I could make it on Rakoff rather than on Rakoff, that'd give me a jumping off point, raking leaves, which could segue into a cool arts and crafts projects that will help fall migrate to the holidays, but then I wouldn't know exactly how I'd get back to David, who is definitely not a Dave, and refer to him in a roundabout tangential way essential to a familiar essay. He teaches that, and I should at least attempt to do him justice. And this familiar essay must be read aloud in front of people who know I'm not all that funny, especially when I'm trying. And what if I'm suddenly stricken with the inability to read my own words, or they get tangled by my tongue, which, as most people know, happens often. Or I somehow used my orange pen to make a streak across my cheek, and no one has had the decency to whisper it in my ear. Or I can't for the life of me picture anyone in this room naked, and I won't be able to make certain that they will, or, which most people know happens often. Or I somehow use my orange pen to make a streak across my cheek, and no one has had the decency to whisper it in my ear. Or I can't for the life of me picture anyone in the room naked, making certain that no one will be able to tell that I've written all of this without a period, until now. I could steal from another first-class humor writer, like Patty Marx, but Patty and I aren't really on a first-name basis, so I'd have to call her Patricia. But she might think borrowing is offensive and I wouldn't know it. Or I could steal from a prolific editor like Dan Menaker. I mean, stealing is one of the highest forms of flattery, but then I'd be flattering Dan Menaker and not really David himself. And he'll have a good quote. He'll say, "You'd have to watch out for David's sentences, because they're like really... You'd have to watch out for David's sentences, because they're like an Easter egg hunt for alert readers, in that gems, or eggs, crop up in the middle of places where you might least expect them, and where they have essentially no right to be, except there they are. In other words, they're like items of funny and morbid buried treasure, or Easter eggs, and if you're not careful, and if you don't read these sentences as they've earned the right to be read, you'll have missed some of the wonderful experiences." And how does one top that? Except that Dan's sentence doesn't mention that this David has contributed immensely to the social good by giving us another way to talk about our anxiety and our fears and my inherent dislike of people around me. I mean, our want to sometimes just stay snuggled in our apartments and look out the window. Because where Dan's sentence fails is that it doesn't say that sometimes it really is comforting to see the world as half-empty. With utmost respect, please welcome the 2011 Thurber Prize winner, David Rakoff.
Holy shit, how does one follow the introduction? That's truly unbelievable. I'm just gobsmacked. Thank you. It's so funny, you know, I saw a guy named Bobby Finkel eating out of a dumpster when I came down here. Just saying. Suzanna, where'd you go? So this is from the book, Half-Empty. How's the sound, okay? It's called All the Time We Have. And my apologies, I read it in Southampton this summer. My apologies to anybody who's having to hear it for the second time.
I requested it.
Oh, thank you. Which would be, in fact, the second time, only the second time that I've ever read it out loud. So, let's try it. Many are the tears of grief. There are those who might even say the majority that fall for no one but the one who is shedding them. A literary agent I knew, his AIDS-related symptoms escalating daily, decided to retire from the business and make a graceful exit before his final reckoning. He called up his clients to tell them he was, in essence, dying, and one of his writers, his eardrums barely done trembling from the sound waves of this news, responded with an immediate and lachrymose, "But who's going to represent me?" Would that this was even fractionally as aberrant as it is appalling. At the memorial service of another literary agent, a giantess in her field, one of her stars, a mystifyingly, wildly successful children's book author with a penchant for neo-feminist retellings of fairy tales and a cloying, breathless prose style given to phrases like, "Oh, but how she did run like the wind," and "stealing out into the darkling night with naught but a loaf of wheaten bread and a flagon of ginger beer," found it charming to tell the assembled crowd that her 6-year-old granddaughter, upon hearing of the death, responded with a wailed, "But she was going to be my agent." I kept these cautionary tales in mind when I made my way to that dump known as Beth Israel Medical Center to visit Del. Del had been my therapist, an agent of a different, more important stripe. His efforts in my behalf were Herculean. He earned every dollar I ever paid him. I had been a chilly and resistant Analyzan from the start, although I stayed with him for 10 years. I once admitted to a woman at a dinner party that I'd never once cried in therapy. "Never?" she asked, astonished. "Your therapist is no good." "No, my therapist is very good," I joked, "but I'm better." That I was ever able to extricate myself from my day job and become a writer was largely thanks to Del. The debt I owed him was unpayable. Even so, when I finally quit, the thought that I might never see him again was only mildly troubling. The very notion of post-treatment contact struck me as inappropriate. Having grown up surrounded by psychiatrists, I lacked that general curiosity people seem to have about shrinks, or their own shrinks at least. From a very young age, I can recall being out in public and seeing my father stop suddenly, or if we were sitting at a table, there it is, sitting at a table, subtly turn his back to the restaurant and face us, an attempt not to be seen by a patient. Sometimes it was unavoidable, and efficient hello might be exchanged, but we knew, my siblings and I, notwithstanding the eager smiles and eyes that raked over us like searchlights, that we would not be introduced. These were not social interactions, and any questions we might have would emphatically not be entertained, although I can't remember having any. Chalk it up to time and place, the 1960s and early 70s in Canada, where a British Reserve still overlaid society. Things were different in New York, I have been told. The membrane between shrink and patient was more permeable. That still seems to be the case. Once at a birthday party for a friend, her former psychiatrist got up and sang a Joni Mitchell song. Putting aside the romantic declaration of the lyrics, "I want to knit you a sweater, want to write you a love letter," appalled italics my own, it just seemed improper to me. I could never really get with the looser program. There were aspects of my relationship with Del that played out in the usual transferential manner, the craving for his approval, the briefest flashes of displaced anger on my part, but that the classic desire for intimacy didn't really come up for me. I didn't hunger for details of Del. I was never moved to Google him, or as we used to call it back in 1989 when I started treatment, look him up in the phone book. I gleaned things about him over the years without trying. He was from Omaha, He had a Jewish father and had been raised in a Jewish household, but had seen fit to formally convert in adulthood. I translated the Hebrew of the rabbinical document of conversion that he had shown me. He had been a practicing Buddhist for years. I even found myself marching behind him one year during Gay Pride. That was not the bombshell. I had gone looking for a gay therapist from the beginning. He looked back and he smiled, and there was no internal flutter. Like when a child, I would see a beloved teacher beyond the confines of the classroom. I didn't even take the opportunity to see who he was marching with. The moment seemed nothing more than ripe for a joke. "It's my therapist," I said to my friends. "Quick, knock me to the ground and pee on me." Not long before we decided to terminate, no doubt exhausted by years' worth of pulling teeth and scoping around for some last-ditch effort and tactic to crack me wider than I'd theretofore allowed, Dell started to employ that old reporter's trick of disclosing things about himself in hopes that I might finally, monkey-like, proffer confessions of my own. He extolled the benefits of acupressure and how it had cured a bowel obstruction he'd had. Ick. He mentioned a recent trip to Cuba and how beautiful the men were, though, quote, "we figured they were mostly hustlers," unquote. He added, I did not inquire who the we were. Once when I was leaving, he even told me that my blue shirt was doing, quote, "wonderful things for my eyes," all to no avail. Finally, he stopped me one day mid-rant about being broke or human rights in China, and he said, "David, I'm between a rock and a hard place here. I hear and I understand your anxiety about money, but we have something like 7 sessions left, and we have to at least talk about your leaving." Turning things around, I asked him what his feelings were about our ending things. "I'm incredibly angry," he responded fondly. "How dare you? You should at least have to come and have coffee with me once a week." I asked him if he felt this way about most of his patients. "Not really," he responded. Sigh. Should you happen to be possessed of a certain verbal acuity coupled with a relentless hair-trigger humor and surface cheers spackling over a chronic melancholia and loneliness, a grotesquely caricatured version of your deepest self which you trot out at the slightest provocation to endearing and glib comic effect, thus rendering you the kind of fellow who is beloved by all, yet loved by none, all of it to distract, however fleetingly, from the cold and dead-faced truth that with each passing year you face the unavoidable certainty of a solitary future in which you will one day perish while vainly attempting the Heimlich maneuver on yourself in the back of the kitchen chair, then this confirmation that you have triumphed again and managed to gull yet another mark, except this time it was the one person you'd hoped might be immune to your ever creakier, puddle-shallow, sideshow Barker version of adorable, even though you'd been launching this campaign weekly with a single-minded determination from day one. Well, it conjures up feelings that are best described as mixed. At the end of our last session, I stood up to leave and I put out my hand. "No way," he said, and pulled me into an embrace. In our 10 years of acquaintance, it was the first and only time we'd ever touched. Bills, breath mints, money had all passed between us in hermetic and sanitary non-contact. I was shocked to find out that he was shorter than me. There is that archetypal moment in a woman's film where a title card reading 3 years later comes up, and then you see the protagonists a little wiser with incipient crow's feet, their hair a little duller, perhaps their clothes most definitely better, meeting across the table at 21 or the Biltmore room where they bring each other up to date on all that's happened on the intervening time since all of their dreams came true. Or did they? I wrote and I dedicated a book to Dell and I mailed him a copy, but I had already heard through the grapevine that a virulent and aggressive colon cancer had forced him to close up his practice, seemingly within a matter of a few short weeks. He was very moved, but he begged my indulgence. He had little energy or focus for reading. He was already in hospice care at Beth Israel, which I think I mentioned previously as a dump. Although he sounded positively cheery on the phone. He would love a visit. I asked if I could bring him anything, and without hesitation, he he asked for 2 Budweisers, a Big Mac, large fries, and a Diet Pepsi, his last hurrah. I was reminded of the only true fight we'd ever had. He had once asked if he could eat during a session. I didn't care. I saw him at the end of the day, and he didn't have a moment to himself. Dell's supper was a Tupperware container of unhulled grains and some dark, leafy greens. If a Joan Baez song could be food, this was it. A sad and earnest cloacal scouring pad of a meal. This was around 1991, a period during which I was spending a good amount of my time shuttling back and forth among New York's AIDS wards and visiting sick friends. I made numerous shopping trips to the Integral Yoga store on 13th Street, where I would root around in the bins of grimy vegetables for exactly these ingredients for one friend who was piebald purple with Kaposi's legion. I asked Dell if everything was all right with his health. He didn't mind that I would ask such a question, but he took issue with the way that I had asked it. I thought I had invested my voice with a calm assurance and a let's not worry until there's something to worry about unflappability. To his ears, I had sounded clipped, harsh, and unforgiving. I had always appreciated my own oncologist's English stoicism and distaste for sowing false hopes. A man who, when at the age of 22 I asked if my impending chemotherapy would have side effects, responded with a bright eye, "Oh yes, it's profoundly nauseating, you'll be vomiting within half an hour." Or my erstwhile New York general practitioner whose bedside manner was borderline actionable and hilarious. A man who would say during every single rectal exam, "Bet this takes you back." Right to last Tuesday, I would respond. As I recall, Dell and I reached a chilly détente, each acknowledging the other's different verbal style, but neither of us giving an inch. McDonald's bag in hand, I would have brought him a Cuban hustler if he had but asked. I arrived at Dell's room on a sweltering summer day. He was on the phone. More metastases than man, tipping the scale at 90 pounds maximum, he was sitting up in bed, his underpants gaping around the tops of his emaciated legs. I'd stopped being shocked by that change in appearance. Perhaps years of having seen friends diminished to skeletal shadows of themselves endured me, or perhaps it had more to do with the very odd nature of our bond. "Hi, David," he said, handing me the phone to return to its cradle. Those words always had an avuncular, almost regretful, falling intonation. "You look good," he said appraisingly. "Actually, I take that back. You look fine, but there's a slight reserve, a kind of a sadness there." I gave him a no shit Sherlock look, which made us laugh. I poured his Diet Pepsi into a small cup, and I stirred it to get the bubbles out. He slowly unwrapped the hamburger, took a tiny bite, chewed it for a few seconds, and then discreetly spat it out into a napkin. His interest in the food was gestural at best. He could no longer digest solids. His systems were breaking down. He was to be fitted with a PICC line later that day, a port that bypasses the smaller veins and lets the pain meds go more directly into his system. All of these were signs that he was, quote, getting closer, as he put it. "I'll have to deal with that emotionally," he said. For the next 3 hours, I fell into my preferred hospital room function of bustling around, picking things up, replacing the ice in the pitcher, delivering the cookies I made in his behalf to the nurse's station, deadheading the flowers. He catnapped and we talked. He expressed some mild regret, what can only have been the merest tip of a ship-splintering iceberg, that he hadn't traveled more. California. I went there and I thought, this is marvelous. One really needs a month here to explore this place properly. He had desperately wanted to go to Italy, but delayed 2 critical weeks until he was too sick. "But I saw Tibet," he said. This was all a surprise. As a resentful 20-something filled with rage, I had constructed an angry fantasy of this man getting rich off of my dollars, financing country houses and numerous trips abroad with money to abandon, while I scraped together my pennies so that weekly I might enjoy the dubious privilege of dredging up feelings I'd have rather have kept tamped down. Later in the afternoon, I don't recall how it came up, I certainly did not ask, he mentioned as how he was planning on being cremated. A friend of mine knows a place in Florida where Krishnamurti might have been, so I'm going to have some of my ashes scattered there. As for the rest of him, the implication was that whatever was left over from this panhandle Hajira really didn't concern him. Where Krishnamurti might have been? There was something so utterly bleak about this disposal being cast into an apathetic wind in a place whose significance was little more than a matter of conjecture. The relinquishing of craving and thereby achieving detachment is perhaps the noblest of the Four Noble Truths, I know, but I wanted nothing more than to take him in my arms and moor him to the here and now. This all felt like some obstinate standing on principle on his part. The spiteful child taking leave of a world that he felt had cared for him insufficiently. Dell would have said I was projecting, as would anyone, frankly. I didn't know anything about his life to justify this conclusion, but I wished that I could turn to those closest to him and say, talk some sense into him. Tell him how much we love him. Then I might have told him as much myself, only occurs to me now. A nurse came in to check his diminishing vitals, along with someone from his temple who was going to say some prayers. They drew the curtains around him, and I stepped out into the hallway. Searching through literature on therapists' deaths and its effect on their patients, I come up with scant material. One analyst, in introducing his article on the subject, wrote, quote, "A few heroic analysts have described their work in the face of life-threatening illness. However, there are only limited descriptions of these illnesses and deaths from the patient's point of view. Experiences of less heroic colleagues are almost unavailable." That he would characterize as less than heroic the tending to one's own impending death, whether by having one's days filled with the projectile expulsion of vomit, bile, or God knows what else, until one is an empty sack of lifeless meat, or the pre-morbid twilight of a pain-masking morphine drip or a PICC line, or by simply having the narcissistic, cowardly goal to buy the farm by sailing through a windshield and scrambling one's brains on the pavement with nary a thought given to one's patients, was precisely what I found so troubling when people said, "That must be very intense for you," when I told them that Dell was dying. It was. I suppose it is always intense to lose someone, and Dell was an unbelievably good egg. His being under 55 seemed doubly unjust, and he'd quite literally saved my life to boot. But given my decades' worth of egocentric monologue, would I be grieving a man or the imminent demise of a reliquary of my deepest pains, most artful observations, and wittiest bon mot? Was I mourning the cancellation of the David Show? Who's going to represent me? I didn't feel entitled to that particular hue of despond. Outside of Dell's hospital room, I listened to the low chanting of the sutras. There was a framed copy of the New York State Patients' Bill of Rights posted on the wall. It was written in English and Spanish and also Yiddish. Rosetta Stony, with the English translation at the top, I read through the text. In about 5 years' time, I thought, this version would no longer be relevant, even at a place like Beth Israel. An era was passing. After about 30 minutes, Dell's friend came out to tell me he had fallen asleep. I went home. I would not see him again. A day or two later, the following dream just before waking, a phone call from Dell. "Hi, David. I'm much better. And in fact, we're going to meet for dinner at 7 just around the corner. And the head of oncology will be there too." And suddenly, there he is. Only now he is a small boy, no older than 6. Fresh from a bath, his hair black and wet and combed. Between Dell and myself, only one of us had dark hair, and it was not Dell. Wearing light blue pajamas, he climbs onto my lap. "Look," he whispers, unbuttoning the jacket. The pale skin of his chest is marred by something, a tattoo, or a wound, or a scarification. Whichever it is clear this injury is a devotional mark. Incised for my benefit, it is a bruise of allegiance that would be carried forever.
going to say, after David read that this summer, Billy Collins had his students do a graph of some of those sentences. So, here's
That's all right.
questions? No question for you. What do you think about Israel?
What do you think about what?
Beth Israel.
I have a question. Andrew, can you talk a little bit about the book that you're working on that will be done by Thanksgiving, no doubt?
Yeah.
Yes, quite. Yes, it's a book about how families respond to various kinds of challenging and unusual offspring. So it's sort of got the framing device. It opens with the material that I read and some other material about what it was like to be the gay child of straight parent, and then it looks at all kinds of other situations and tries to look at the relationship between illness and identity. So how do families respond to children who have some defining quality that's foreign to them? Families of deaf people, of autistic people, families of prodigies who are also quite overwhelmed, families of people who commit crimes, families of people who are transgender. I have 10 of these categories. And then I've got a conclusion, which is about becoming a father and the way in which, having interviewed and met all of these families and followed so many extraordinary lives, affected my ability to decision to experience of becoming a parent.
What's it called?
Far from the tree.
Nice.
We like that? It's still, I like it. My editor and I go back and forth. Far from the tree, parents, children, and the search for identity is the subtitle.
I was going to ask how extreme, you mentioned who commit crimes. That's precisely what I was wondering, like how's a family whose child is, shot up at school, or something even worse if such a thing,
Well,
what was the most extreme example that you...
I mean, it's funny that you mention that, because one of the families that I interviewed was the family of Dylan Klebold, who was one of the perpetrators of the Columbine massacre. And it was a really extraordinary, I went out there thinking that when I met them, I would see what was wrong in that family that had led to this. And they're actually incredibly, sorry, am I inaudible?
No, it's good. I just want to.
They're actually incredibly lovely and quite wonderful people, and I talked to them on many occasions. There were two particularly striking moments. Like, we recorded hundreds of hours together, but one of them was when I was sitting in their dining room. I was staying at the house. I said, if Dylan were here right now, I said, is there anything you'd want to ask him? And his father said, there sure is. I'd want to ask him what the hell he thought he was doing. And his mother kind of looked at the floor and thought for a second, and then she looked back up and said, I would ask him to forgive me for being his mother and never knowing what was going on inside his head. And then a year after that, I was out there and I was talking to her, and we talked a little bit about that conversation, in fact. And she said, I used to think if I'd never gone to Ohio State, I'd never have met Tom, we'd never have had these children, this wouldn't have happened, and I used to sort of wish for that, but I've really thought about it, and I decided that I loved the children I had so much that even with all of this, I wouldn't want to give them up for anything. So while I recognize that it would have been better for the world if Dylan had never been born, I believe it would not have been better for me.
Wow.
Wow.
Did you research death of a therapist and its effect on patients in the same way you could research transference?
No, it was very hard to find anything. That was almost the only thing that I ever came up with.
I was just wondering, because you did so much research, maybe not so much on therapy, but did you find anything in your work about the death of a therapist or the effect of the death of a therapist?
No, I can't say that I did. I didn't look for it in particular, but I don't know of
I think
anything
Amy
about that.
writes a nice story about a psychoanalyst a psychotherapist who's dying, and she starts to fix her patients up with each other. It's a lovely story, but there wasn't a lot.
Yeah.
But I'm not a very good researcher. There's probably like literally, like
You're right.
in that office, a huge trove of like, books and
Isn't that
articles.
billboard in Times Square?
Exactly. Well, 1-800, my therapist.
Patty, I'm curious about that. Do you have a question? Go ahead.
I was just going to ask David, since you've been teaching the last couple of years, I think you're relatively new to it. I was curious about the impact of teaching on your own writing.
Besides sucking it
Yeah, no, there's been no discernible effect. I haven't got a lot of writing done, but that's not attributable to the teaching at all. No particular discernible effect. I mean, it all just seems as beyond a kind of a gratitude that I am not the one being given the assignment. It's always the thing. It's just like, I could not do that assignment. Couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. Thank God I'm not the one having it. But that's not a, that's not a genuine effect. Just kind of a hoodwinked, pulled the wool over gratitude and waiting for the jig to be up.
Could I ask, Patricia, how did you come up with the idea for that book?
That book that I got from,
Mm-hmm.
or another book that I got. I have no idea. It was the first book I wrote, and I don't know. I think I'd been reading, and I don't even know why, some book maybe it was it Samuel Goldman? No, Edie. Maybe like somebody's memo of some. I don't know. I don't know. A long time ago. It's kind of, what am I going to write about? I don't know.
I have one more question for David. I've seen something in, I think it was New York Magazine, where they're writing about something about comedy, and they mentioned the Upright Citizens Brigade, which you had done some work for. And I was curious about what you were writing at the time. Were you writing familiar essays when you were doing that, or what were you when you weren't writing specifically? Because that was all ad-lib, wasn't it? I can't remember.
Yeah, that was just, a little bit of, the audience would give a suggestion, then you'd have to sort of riff on that. I can't remember what all I was doing, just, general freelance writing.
Okay.
They weren't super connected. I mean, it was, just an evening with friends, and then you'd go home. And, but it was all of 5 minutes worth of material. It certainly wasn't super germane to, and indeed, it's not a world that I'm super comfortable in. The only funny world is just kind of makes me anxious. I'm just not,
But the only anxious world makes you funny.
So I have one more question for Patty, if no one else has one. What were the therapy parts?
I
Was
know
it
you
plots
avoided
or-
them.
Oh, should I read a
Is
half
that-
page?
What does that
Yeah.
mean?
Yes.
The therapist works at Dave Psychiatric Hospital, which is a private hospital, and he,
Is this a real hospital?
what do you think? He's talking about Ferris Canale, who is the director of that Bucky gets. He meets him at the psychiatric at Dave's. So there are about six speeches of his, and I'll just read one. Let's see. Frankly, I was against Ferris's release, and Ferris Canale, the director. Foremost, I felt he wasn't stable enough, and that a premature release would jeopardize his mental health for the rest of his life. Also, we always, well, to tell you the truth, after all of us have evaluated a new patient, we make kind of a, well, frankly, we take bets. We bet on how long the patient will be here. If we'll get better or worse, just little things to keep the job interesting. And I had bet that Ferris would be here for 18 to 24 months. Our choices come in 6-month intervals. But he'd only been here 8 months when he decided to leave. That meant Dr. Simons was going to win. He always cleans up, that Simons. He really understands the mentally ill. Some people have it, I guess, some don't. I told Bucky that Ferris was not ready to work. He was at a very delicate stage in his treatment. And to remove him now and thrust him into the world was like, well, have you ever had a cake in the oven and after, say, 15 minutes or so, just as it's beginning to form, to stand up a little on its own and be like other cakes? You take it out and you cut it and it quivers and collapses and is no use as a cake? No, of course you haven't. No one has. It would be stupid. It wouldn't help you. It wouldn't help the cake. That's what I told Bucky. I pleaded with him. I said, Ferris can't solve his problems yet. Please don't take him out of the oven yet. Not till he's done. Let's see. Well,
I would like to say something before it all ends. Can I?
Yes.
Those introductions were unfucking
Oh,
believable.
yeah.
That's what I mean by the relief of not having to do the assignment. Is like,
Oh, man.
I would never have been able to do that.
No, I would have just gone to Wikipedia and copied something.
I wouldn't have even done that. I would have, I don't know, coughed and, that's it.
No,
They were beautiful. They were marvelous.
And might I say, only a day or two to prepare.
Whoa.
Wow.
So thank you everyone for coming, and there's book signing and of course the cheese cubes. So.